The rain poured relentlessly, turning the cracked pavement into glistening pools of light beneath the flickering street lamps. David stood frozen on the sidewalk, his heartbeat drowning out the noise of the city around him. Across the street, behind the smudged glass of an old diner, sat the girl he had been searching for. 7 years. 7 years of endless dead ends, false leads, and sleepless nights, only to find her here, sipping coffee like she had never been gone. She was alive. But something was wrong. The girl he had been searching for was not the same girl sitting in front of him now. David was not a detective. He was not a father grieving for his lost child. He had no legal obligation to find Emily. Yet, for the past 7 years, he had lived as if her disappearance was the only thing that mattered. When Emily vanished, the world moved on. The police conducted their investigations, her family pleaded for answers on television, and for a few months, the town whispered her name in fearful conversations. Then, the headlines faded. The reporters stopped calling. Her case became just another missing person file in an overstuffed cabinet, waiting for time to bury it deeper. But David could not forget. Emily was 11 when she disappeared, a quiet girl with dark curls and a shy smile. She had walked home from school like she always did. She had been seen near the grocery store at 3:42 p.m. She had turned a corner, and she was never seen again. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no ransom note, just an empty space where she had once been. Most people accepted the reality Emily was gone, dead or worse, taken by someone who had left no trace. David never accepted that. What had started as a simple news article, just another missing child case, became an obsession. The details did not add up. The disappearance was too clean. There were no suspects, no motives, no theories that made sense. Every few months, he uncovered something, an old security camera frame, a witness statement that contradicted the last, an anonymous tip that led to nowhere. The puzzle pieces never fit. And yet, here she was, sitting in a diner like she had never been missing at all. David took a step forward, his mind racing with questions. But before he could cross the street, before he could call out her name, she looked up. And when their eyes met, his stomach dropped. There was no recognition in her gaze. Emily did not know who he was. The autumn air was crisp on the afternoon Emily disappeared. Leaves swirled across the sidewalk, and the scent of burning wood lingered from chimneys lining the quiet suburban streets. It was an ordinary Wednesday, at least. That was what everyone believed at the time. Emily had left school at exactly 3:30 p.m., just like she did every day. The bell rang, and she followed the usual routine, stuffing her books into her backpack, waving goodbye to her friends, and adjusting the straps as she stepped onto the sidewalk. She walked alone. She always did. A security camera from a nearby bookstore caught her at 3:42 p.m., crossing the street near Wilton's Grocery. The footage showed her looking both ways before stepping onto the crosswalk. She was in no hurry, no signs of distress. A woman in a red coat passed her going the opposite direction. A man exited the store behind her, carrying a bag of oranges. She turned the corner. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Emily did not come home by 4 p.m., her mother assumed she had been delayed. Maybe she had stopped by the corner store to buy candy. Maybe a friend's mother had invited her in for a snack. These things happened. By 4:30 p.m., the first hint of worry crept in. By 5 p.m., that worry had turned into panic. Emily's mother, Karen, called the neighbors. None of them had seen her. The school was closed by then, the hallways dark and empty. She called Emily's friends, but they had all gone straight home after school. By 6 p.m., the police were involved. A small town like theirs did not see many missing persons cases, and at first, the officers assumed she would turn up. Maybe she had gotten lost. Maybe she had gone to visit someone and lost track of time. Kids wandered off. They would find her soon. But as the hours dragged on, those hopeful possibilities began to fade. By midnight, the town was covered in search teams. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Voices called her name, and flyers were already being printed. People scoured the streets, backyards, wooded areas. They checked the park, the playground, the old warehouse on 5th Street. Nothing. No backpack. No jacket. No footprints in the dirt. It was as if Emily had vanished into thin air. Most disappearances leave some kind of trace. A struggle. A broken object. A dropped piece of clothing. But with Emily, there was nothing. The police combed through hours of security footage. They saw her leave the school. They saw her walk down the street. They saw her cross at the grocery store. And then she turned the corner. The next camera should have picked her up a few seconds later. It was positioned just 20 feet ahead, facing the street she had been walking toward. But the footage never showed her. She never came into frame. It was impossible. 1 second she was there, the next gone. For days, detectives replayed the footage over and over again. They searched for cars that might have stopped beside her, for figures lurking in the shadows. They interviewed the woman in the red coat, the man with the oranges. Neither had noticed anything unusual. It was like the earth had swallowed her whole. And the longer she remained missing, the more the theories started to spiral. Some believed she had been kidnapped by someone who knew the area well, someone who had planned every detail. Others whispered about something worse, something unexplainable. The way she disappeared so suddenly, some said it was unnatural. But David did not believe in ghost stories. He believed in facts. And the facts told him one thing. Somebody out there knew exactly what happened to Emily, and they had spent the past 7 years making sure nobody else ever found out. The world forgot about Emily after a few months. At first, her case had been everywhere. News headlines, local broadcasts, missing posters on street corners. The town held candlelight vigils, reporters interviewed her tearful parents, and law enforcement gave empty reassurances. But when the months turned into a year, interest faded. Leads dried up. The media moved on. Her family was left with nothing but an empty room, a missing poster curling at the edges, and a question that no one could answer. Where did she go? By the second year, even those who once searched for her started to lose hope. The police had no suspects. No new evidence had surfaced. The world had moved on. Except for David. David was not related to Emily. He had no personal connection to her family. He had covered many missing person cases as a journalist, but there was something about this case that haunted him. Something felt wrong. Most disappearances had patterns, clues, warning signs, suspicious figures in the background. But Emily's case had nothing. And that made no sense. It started small. David kept a file of old case notes, periodically checking for updates. He would scroll through missing person databases, cross-referencing names and locations. He convinced himself it was routine, just another case to follow. But routine turned into obsession. Years passed, and the mystery of Emily's disappearance remained unsolved. He read every interview, watched every news clip, spoke to detectives who had worked on the case. He wanted to understand. By the third year, he realized something terrifying. There were gaps in the investigation, deliberate ones. The first time David noticed something off, he was going through the archived police reports. The case file was too clean, too simple. Missing child. No evidence. Case cold. But missing person reports were never that simple. So he dug deeper. Emily's school records showed no behavioral issues. No reports of bullying. No family disputes. She had been an average student, quiet, polite. No reason to run away. Police reports from the day she disappeared showed contradicting witness statements, small discrepancies no one seemed to question. One witness swore she had seen Emily near the bus stop. Another claimed she had walked toward the old playground. Both sightings happened minutes apart, in opposite directions. That was the first red flag. The second red flag came when David contacted one of the original detectives on the case. The man was retired, but when David mentioned Emily's name, the conversation changed. The detective's voice tightened. He hesitated before speaking. That case, he muttered. You need to let it go. Why? David pressed. Because it was never solved? A pause. Then, something David did not expect. Because it was never meant to be solved. That was the moment David knew something was being hidden. A case this big, this unsolved, should have been an open investigation. The police should have kept the files active, should have followed every new tip. But instead, it was as if someone wanted Emily to be forgotten. David refused to let that happen. By year 5, his obsession had cost him everything: his job, his personal life, his sleep. His friends told him to move on, that it was not his responsibility. But he could not shake the feeling that Emily was still out there. He just needed to find the missing piece. Then, one day, he got it. A letter arrived at his apartment. No return address. No name. Just a single sentence, handwritten on a piece of paper. She is alive, but you may not want to find her. David's hands trembled as he held the note. Somebody knew the truth. And now, so would he. David stared at the letter, his fingers pressing into the thin paper as if holding it tighter would make its meaning clear. She is alive, but you may not want to find her. The words looped in his mind, each one sending a fresh wave of unease through his chest. This was not a prank. The handwriting was rushed, as if the writer had been in a hurry. There was no signature, no address, nothing but the single sentence that had changed everything. For 7 years, there had been nothing, no leads, no proof, no whispers of where Emily could be. And now this. Someone knew where she was, and they were warning him to stay away. David's first instinct was to check where the letter had been mailed from. The postmark was faint, nearly smudged out, but he could still make out a partial location: Lexington, Nevada. A town he had never heard of. A town over 1,200 miles away from where Emily had disappeared. A small, almost forgotten place. The first thing he did was search for any connection between Emily and Lexington. A childhood visit? A family relative? A distant friend? Nothing. There was no reason for her to be there. No connection, no record. But someone wanted him to know. Someone chose to send him this message. And David was going to find out why. It took him less than an hour to pack. His old case files went into his bag first. The missing posters, the police reports, the old newspaper articles that had yellowed at the edges. Every clue, every dead end, everything he had gathered over 7 years. Then, his notebook, pages filled with theories, notes, names of people who had given up on the case long ago. Finally, his recorder, the one he had used during his investigative journalism years. He was no longer a reporter, but some habits never died. He booked the first available flight to Nevada. Something inside him whispered that this was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the first real lead, the first real hope. But there was also a voice, small but insistent, buried deep in his gut. What if she does not want to be found? Lexington, Nevada, was exactly what he expected it to be. Small, quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The kind of place where strangers were noticed immediately. The town sat under an endless stretch of sky, surrounded by desert roads that twisted into nothingness. A single diner, a rundown motel, a gas station that had seen better days. A town forgotten by time. And yet, this was where the letter had come from. David felt every eye on him as he stepped inside the only coffee shop in sight. It was the kind of place where no one needed a menu, where people did not need to introduce themselves because they already knew everything about each other. He approached the counter, pulling out the worn photograph of Emily from his pocket. The waitress, middle-aged, kind eyes, wiping down the counter, paused when she saw it. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition. It was quick, barely a second. But David caught it. She knew something. His heart pounded as he placed the photo on the counter, keeping his voice steady. "Have you seen this girl before?" She hesitated. The cloth in her hand twisted. Then, in a quiet voice, she said something that sent a shiver through his spine. "You should not be asking about her." David's grip on the photo tightened. Why not? She looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then she lowered her voice even more. Because last time someone asked about her, they never left this town. The diner fell silent. David could feel it, the sudden shift in the air, the way conversations had died out around him. People were listening. People were watching. The waitress kept her eyes low, as if regretting what she had just said. Her hand trembled slightly as she wiped an invisible stain from the counter, avoiding his gaze. "What do you mean by that?" David pressed, keeping his voice calm. She shook her head. "I cannot help you. Do you know her?" He tapped the worn photograph of Emily. A pause. Too long of a pause. Then she whispered, "I think you should leave, sir." The people in the diner had returned to their meals, but David could feel the weight of their stares. He could hear the low murmurs, the stolen glances in his direction. Something was not right. David knew the look of a town hiding secrets. He had spent years reporting on places like this, small towns where truths were buried deep and only spoken about in hushed voices, if at all. Places where people knew more than they let on, but chose silence over the risk of speaking. Lexington, Nevada, was one of those places. And whatever had happened to Emily, they knew. David stepped outside, inhaling the dry desert air. There were two choices. He could leave now, pretend he had never received the letter. Forget the look in the waitress's eyes, the way her fingers had clenched around the rag when she saw Emily's photo. Or he could keep digging. He had already lost 7 years to this search. What was one more day? His first stop was the post office. He needed to track down whoever had sent him the letter. If he could find the sender, he could find Emily. But when he showed the letter to the clerk, the answer made his stomach tighten. "Sorry, sir. We do not track letters like that. No name, no return address." It could have been dropped in any box in town. "Is there any way to know who sent it?" David asked. The clerk hesitated. Then, lowering his voice, he said something unexpected. "Try the motel. A lot of strangers pass through there. Someone must have seen something." David nodded, slipping the letter back into his pocket. The motel. That was his next stop. But as he walked back to his car, a prickling sensation crawled up the back of his neck. Someone was watching him. Slowly, he turned. A man stood across the street, half hidden behind a parked truck. His posture was too still, his eyes too focused on David. And when David took a step toward him, the man turned and walked away. Not just walked, disappeared. David's heart pounded. Somebody did not want him here. But that only meant one thing. He was getting close. David pulled into the parking lot of the only motel in town. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie red glow onto the cracked pavement. The building itself looked forgotten, like it belonged to a different time, peeling paint, a buzzing street lamp, and a vacancy sign that had probably never been turned off. He killed the engine but did not step out immediately. His fingers tapped the steering wheel as he watched the entrance. This place held answers. It had to. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his bag, pocketed the letter, and stepped out into the warm desert night. A bell jingled as he pushed open the glass door. Behind the counter sat an old man, hunched over a newspaper. His glasses perched low on his nose, and he barely glanced up when David entered. "Need a room?" he muttered, turning a page. "Actually," David said, pulling out Emily's photograph and placing it on the counter. "I was hoping you could help me with something." The man's fingers froze mid-page turn. For a second, there was no reaction, no change in expression, no shift in posture. But David saw the subtle flicker in his gaze, the way his breathing stilled. He recognized her. David leaned forward. "You know her, don't you?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. He closed the newspaper and slowly looked up. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said, voice suddenly guarded. A lie. David had spent too many years reading people to miss it. "Listen," David pressed, lowering his voice. "I have been searching for her for 7 years. Someone from this town sent me a letter saying she is alive. I need to know the truth." The old man exhaled sharply. "You should not have come here," he muttered, rubbing his temple. "This town, it does not like outsiders digging around." "I do not care what this town likes," David snapped. "All I care about is finding her. So tell me, do you know where she is?" A long silence stretched between them. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Then, finally, the old man sighed. "Room 9, he said quietly. "Second floor." Into the hall. David's pulse kicked up. "She is here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man hesitated, then shook his head. "Not anymore." But she was. David's heart pounded. This was the closest he had ever been to an answer. How long ago? Few months. Maybe longer. The man wiped his glasses, his hands shaking slightly. "She never told us her real name, but we knew she was hiding. Never caused trouble. Kept to herself." "Did she leave alone?" A pause. The old man's jaw clenched. His fingers tapped nervously against the counter. "No," he finally admitted. David's stomach twisted. "Who took her?" The man opened his mouth, then stopped. His face drained of color. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window. David followed his gaze and froze. A black sedan sat idling in the parking lot, headlights off. Watching. David's pulse slammed in his ears. Someone knew he was here, and they did not want him asking questions. The black sedan did not move. Its engine was off, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. David's instinct screamed danger. The motel owner had gone silent, gripping the counter like he was holding on to a secret too big to carry. "Who is that?" David asked, keeping his voice low. The old man swallowed hard. He was afraid. "Listen to me," he whispered. "You need to leave. Right now. Get in your car and drive. If they know you are asking about her, you're already in trouble." David's pulse pounded in his ears. "Who are they?" The old man shook his head. "People you do not want to meet." David was done with cryptic warnings. Emily was here. Someone took her. And now, someone was watching him. His mind raced. He had two choices: walk away or push forward. There was no real choice. He had come too far. He grabbed his motel key off the counter and headed for room 9. The second floor was quiet. Too quiet. David's fingers tightened around the key as he reached the end of the hall. The brass numbers on the door were rusted, but he could still make them out. Room 9. His hands were clammy as he slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open. The room smelled of dust and stale air. The bed was made, the curtains drawn shut, but the feeling was wrong. It was like stepping into a place where time had stopped. David scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that could tell him where Emily had gone. Then he saw it. A small notebook on the nightstand. His chest tightened as he stepped forward, flipping it open. Inside, messy handwriting covered the pages. Not just any handwriting. Emily's handwriting. David turned the pages, skimming frantically. There were fragments of sentences, written in rushed, uneven strokes. I cannot stay here much longer. They found me again. He said it is safer if I leave, but I do not know where to go. If someone is looking for me, tell them I am sorry. David's breath caught. She knew someone was searching for her. His hand shook as he flipped to the last page. There was only one line, scrawled in ink that looked fresher than the rest. If you find this, do not trust them. A chill ran through his spine. She had been running from someone. And now, they were watching him. A floorboard creaked outside. David froze. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Someone was standing outside room 9. His pulse hammered against his ribs. He reached for the doorknob just as bang. A fist slammed against the door. David stumbled back, gripping the notebook tightly. A voice came from the other side. Low. Cold. Step outside, Mr. Miller. They knew his name. David's mind raced. The motel owner had warned him. The letter had warned him. Emily had warned him. He was in way too deep. Whoever was outside that door was not here to answer his questions. They were here to stop him from asking any more. David's grip on the notebook tightened as the pounding on the door came again. Step outside, Mr. Miller. The voice was steady, emotionless, too calm for someone knocking with that much force. David's mind raced. There was no good way out of this. If he opened the door, he had no idea what was waiting for him. If he stayed inside, whoever was out there would not leave until they got what they wanted. His eyes flicked to the window. Second floor. A risky escape. Then, something slid under the door. A folded piece of paper. David hesitated, then bent down, carefully unfolding it. There was only one line, written in familiar, rushed handwriting. They're lying to you. His stomach twisted. Emily. She had written this. Recently. A shadow passed beneath the door. The voice outside turned impatient. You do not want to make this difficult. David made his decision. He was not opening that door. His only way out was the window. He crossed the room quickly, unlocking it with careful hands. The old wood frame groaned as he pushed it up. The alley below was narrow, dark, filled with old dumpsters and broken glass. A hard drop. Not impossible. The pounding on the door became louder. Last chance, Miller. David climbed onto the ledge. His heart pounded. Then he jumped. The impact rattled his bones, sending pain up his knees, but he rolled, gritting his teeth against the shock. For a second, he thought he had made it. Then, a black SUV whipped around the corner, tires screeching. David barely had time to react before two men jumped out, moving fast. He ran. His feet pounded against the pavement. He turned sharply into a side street, weaving through the empty roads of Lexington. The town was too quiet, too empty. His pursuers were not amateurs. They moved with purpose, keeping him in their line of sight but not rushing. They knew these streets better than he did. David's mind spun as he searched for a way out. Then he spotted it, a bus station. A single bus sat idling at the stop, doors open, preparing to leave. He sprinted. The SUV's tires screeched behind him. The men were getting closer. 50 feet. 30. 15. David threw himself onto the bus, barely making it before the doors slammed shut. The driver gave him an unimpressed look. You all right? David nodded, breathless. Just drive. The engine rumbled as the bus pulled away. Through the back window, David saw the black SUV parked at the curb. The men were not following. They were watching. Waiting. They were not done with him. The bus rolled out of town. David forced himself to breathe, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He still had Emily's notebook in his grip. Opening it again, He flipped through the pages, searching for something he had missed. Then, one name jumped out at him. A name that did not belong there. It was written twice, underlined heavily, as if Emily had wanted to remind herself. Jonas Caldwell. David frowned. That name meant nothing to him. But to Emily, it had meant everything. A chill ran through him. Whoever Jonas Caldwell was, he was the next missing piece. And David was going to find him. David sat in the dimly lit corner of a bus station an hour outside of Lexington, his fingers tracing the name in Emily's notebook. Jonas Caldwell. Who was he? A friend? A captor? Someone who had helped her escape? David did not know, but Emily had written it twice, underlined it, made sure it stood out. That meant one thing: Jonas Caldwell was important. He pulled out his phone, quickly searching the name. No immediate hits. No social media profiles, no criminal records, no missing person reports. But after scrolling through old news archives, one article finally caught his eye. Local man found dead in apartment fire. Suspected arson. David's pulse spiked. The date of the article? 6 months ago. Emily had written Jonas's name recently. But if this report was true, Jonas was already dead. David dug deeper. Jonas had lived in a rundown neighborhood just outside Phoenix, Arizona, another 300 miles away from Lexington. Was this where Emily had gone after leaving the motel? Was Jonas the one who had been protecting her? David booked a ticket for the next bus heading south. One way. If Jonas Caldwell had been the last person to see Emily, David needed to know why he was dead, and what that meant for her. Phoenix was nothing like Lexington. No one paid attention to him here. No eyes followed him as he walked down the cracked sidewalks, past flickering neon signs and half-empty bars. Jonas's old apartment complex stood at the edge of the city, a forgotten building that had barely survived the fire that had taken his life. David pushed past the caution tape, stepping inside the charred remains of the apartment. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, the walls blackened from heat. The place had been destroyed, but one thing was clear: this was no accident. This fire had been deliberate, and Jonas had been the target. David stepped carefully over the wreckage, his flashlight flickering across the burned furniture, collapsed ceiling panels, shattered glass. Then he saw something. A metal lockbox, half-melted, wedged between the remains of an old desk. His fingers burned as he pried it open. Inside, only one thing had survived the fire: a single photograph. David pulled it out carefully, brushing away the ash. His breath caught. It was a picture of Emily. Older, different, but still Emily. And she was not alone. She was standing beside Jonas. But it was the third person in the photograph that made David's stomach drop. Because he recognized him. The man standing next to them, looking directly into the camera, was the same man who had been watching David from the black SUV in Lexington. He was still alive. And that meant Emily was still in danger. David sat in the burned-out remains of Jonas Caldwell's apartment, gripping the photograph like it held the answers he had been chasing for 7 years. Emily, Jonas, and the man from the black SUV. This was not a coincidence. Jonas had known Emily. He had protected her. And now, Jonas was dead, his apartment torched, his name wiped clean from every record David had searched. The pieces were falling into place. Someone had tried to erase Jonas. Someone was trying to erase Emily. And now, they were coming for David too. David tucked the photograph into his pocket and left the apartment quickly, keeping his head down as he made his way back to the street. He needed more information. Jonas Caldwell's death had been ruled an accident, but David did not believe that for a second. He found an old police station report on the fire. The details were vague, almost like they had been intentionally left out. No sign of forced entry. No witnesses. No investigation. David scrolled further. Then he saw it. A name buried deep in the report, under next of kin. Emily Sinclair. David's stomach clenched. She had been there. She had reported his death. But if that was true, why had the police never connected Jonas Caldwell to the missing girl case? Why had they let her walk away? Unless they had been told not to look too closely. There was only one person left who could tell David what had happened the night of the fire. The officer who had taken Emily's statement. David found him easily, a retired detective named Henry Collins, living in a small town 2 hours away. He knocked on the door. The man who answered looked tired. Gray beard, wrinkled hands. A man who had been carrying a secret for too long. "If you are here about Jonas Caldwell," Collins said before David even spoke, "you are wasting your time." David pulled out the photograph, holding it up. I am here about her. Collins stared at it for a long time. Then, finally, he sighed and stepped aside. You should not have come looking for her, he muttered. Why not? David pressed. Collins met his gaze, his expression dark, haunted. Because Emily Sinclair does not exist anymore. David stepped inside Henry Collins's small, dimly lit house. The retired detective closed the door behind him, locking it out of habit. A man who still feared what he knew. David sat across from him at the cluttered kitchen table, the photograph of Emily, Jonas, and the unknown man between them. What do you mean Emily Sinclair does not exist? David asked, his voice steady, though his pulse was racing. Collins exhaled slowly, rubbing his weathered hands together. That girl should have never come back, he muttered. She was supposed to be gone forever. David leaned forward. Gone where? The old detective's eyes flickered with something between guilt and warning. The system buried her, he said. For her own safety. David gripped the edge of the table. What do you mean buried? Collins sighed. Emily was part of something she was never supposed to see. She was not kidnapped. She was not running away from home. She was running from something much bigger. And when she tried to come back, someone made sure she disappeared for good. Who? Powerful people, Collins said simply. People who decide who gets to stay on the grid and who does not. David's mind spun. But she was a child. And that is exactly why they let her go the first time. David frowned. The first time? Collins rubbed a hand over his face. Emily was supposed to be dead, Miller. 7 years ago. That was the only way to keep her safe. They changed her name, moved her across the country, gave her a life no one would question. But she came back. Why? Because she could not let go of her past. And Jonas? He tried to protect her. He died for it. David sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he had just heard. So when she went missing, she was not taken, Collins finished. She was hidden. Emily had vanished not because she was abducted, but because someone had erased her existence on purpose. Then why is someone still after her? David asked. If she was supposed to disappear, why do they care now? Collins hesitated. Because she still remembers. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. Emily knew something they had tried to make her forget. And she was still running. Where is she now? David demanded. Collins shook his head. I do not know. But if you keep looking for her, you are going to end up like Jonas. I do not care, David shot back. Collins studied him for a long time, then sighed heavily. There is a train that runs through Santa Fe in 2 days, he said quietly. She might be on it, or she might not. But if you find her, do not ask her to come back. She cannot. David stood at the door, ready to leave. One last thing, Collins called out. David turned back. The old detective's eyes were tired, filled with a sadness that only came from knowing too much. If you really care about that girl, he said, you will let her stay gone. David swallowed hard. That was never going to happen. He was going to find her, even if it meant destroying everything in the process. The train station in Santa Fe was busy, filled with travelers carrying their lives in small suitcases. Announcements echoed overhead, the distant hum of engines roaring as trains arrived and departed. David stood near the ticket counter, his eyes scanning every face, every movement. He had been waiting for 2 hours, watching, searching. Then he saw her. Emily. She was walking toward the platform, her hood pulled up, a small duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She moved quickly, glancing over her shoulder like she knew she was being watched. David's breath caught in his throat. 7 years. 7 years of searching, chasing ghosts, following false leads. And now, here she was, alive, real, right in front of him. He stepped forward, heart pounding. Emily. She froze. Slowly, she turned. Their eyes met. David had imagined this moment 1,000 times, her recognizing him, relief flooding her face, gratitude, maybe even tears. But the girl in front of him? She did not react at all. She just stared, unreadable. Emily, he said again, softer this time. It is me. David. No response. A flicker of something in her eyes, recognition? Fear? Then, she shook her head. You have the wrong person, she said quietly, turning away. David's chest tightened. Do not do this, he pleaded. I know who you are. I have been looking for you. She took a step back. Her hands were shaking. You should not have. Why? She exhaled, her voice breaking. Because I am not Emily anymore. David could hear the train conductor announcing the final boarding call. Emily turned, ready to leave. Wait, he said desperately. I know about Jonas. I know what happened. She flinched. That name meant something. He tried to protect you, David pressed. He died for you. Her hands clenched into fists. I know, she whispered. And that is why I cannot stay. David took a deep breath. Emily, you do not have to run anymore. Finally, she looked at him, really looked at him. And David realized something. She was not afraid of being found. She was afraid of what would happen if she stopped running. If they find me, they will make me disappear again, she said. But this time, they will not let me go. Then let me help you, David pleaded. You do not have to do this alone. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, the train whistle blew. She turned toward the open doors. Emily, please, David said. She hesitated. For a moment, he thought, maybe, just maybe, she would stay. Then, she whispered, I am sorry. And she stepped onto the train. The doors slid shut. David's heart sank as the train pulled away, carrying her back into the unknown. He had found her, and now he was losing her all over again. David stood on the empty platform, watching the train disappear into the distance. The cold air felt heavier now. The weight of 7 years of searching, hoping, believing pressed down on his chest. He had done everything, followed every lead, pushed past every dead end, nearly lost himself in the process. And yet, she still walked away. She had not begged for help. She had not cried, or thanked him, or reached for him the way he had dreamed she would. She had chosen to leave. The truth hit harder than he expected. Emily Sinclair was not the girl he had been searching for. That girl, the shy, quiet 11-year-old with dark curls and hopeful eyes, no longer existed. In her place was someone else, someone who had survived. And survival had come at a price. David turned away from the tracks, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. He had two choices. He could keep chasing her, keep following shadows, digging deeper, risking his own life. Or he could accept the truth. Some people do not want to be found. And maybe, just maybe, finding them is not the same as saving them. He pulled Emily's notebook from his pocket. The pages were worn, edges curled, the ink slightly smudged from time. Her last words played in his mind. I am not Emily anymore. She had meant it. She had spent years erasing herself. And now, after all this time, he had to do the same. Let her go. David checked into a small roadside motel that night, exhausted, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything settled inside him. He had never felt so empty. Sometime after midnight, his phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. His pulse kicked up as he opened it. There was no greeting, no explanation. Just 3 words, and they changed everything. Stop looking back. David sat up, his heart hammering. Emily. She had seen it. Somewhere, out there in the world, she was still watching, still running. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally free. David stared at the message on his phone. Stop looking back. His fingers hovered over the screen, 1,000 responses racing through his mind. Where are you? Are you safe? Why did you run? But deep down, he knew she would never answer. This was not an invitation to follow her. It was a warning. She was telling him to let go. But something did not sit right. David was not the kind of person who ignored his instincts. And right now, they were screaming at him. Emily was alive. But for how long? If she had gone through all this trouble to disappear, why would she break silence just to send him a message? Unless she was not the one who sent it. David opened Emily's notebook again. He flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything, that could tell him what she had been trying to say all along. Then he saw it. In the corner of one of the pages, faint, almost unnoticeable, were a series of numbers. 33.4255 degrees north, 111.9400 degrees west coordinates. David's heart pounded as he typed them into his phone. The location loaded. Phoenix, Arizona, near where Jonas had been killed. His stomach clenched. Emily had written this before she left the motel, before she knew David would find her notebook. She had left him a trail. She had told him to stop looking back, but she had also told him exactly where to go next. Why? Unless she knew she would not make it there herself. David did not sleep. By morning, he was back on the road, heading toward Phoenix. The miles blurred together, his mind racing with possibilities. Was Emily waiting for him? Or was he walking into a trap? Either way, there was no turning back now. He had spent 7 years chasing this mystery. And something told him the real truth had yet to be uncovered. The desert heat pressed against David's skin as he pulled into Phoenix, Arizona. The coordinates Emily had left him led to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by miles of empty road and rusting fences. It was the kind of place where things disappeared without a trace. He parked a safe distance away, scanning the perimeter. No signs of movement. Too quiet. His gut told him this was not just another dead end. Emily had left him this location for a reason. And if he was right, this was where everything would finally make sense. David slipped inside through a side entrance, careful with each step. The warehouse was dark, lit only by streaks of sunlight bleeding through the broken ceiling panels. Dust coated the floor. The air smelled of rust and something stale, something long abandoned. He moved deeper inside, his footsteps echoing through the empty space. Then, in the farthest corner, he saw it. A desk. Not new, not clean, but still standing, covered in scattered files, documents, and papers that had not been touched in years. He stepped closer, heart pounding. This was not just a random location. This had been an operation. And then he saw the words stamped across the top of one of the old files. Project Echo. David's pulse spiked. He did not know what it meant, but he knew one thing. Emily had been part of it. His hand shook as he flipped through the documents. Some were burned at the edges, redacted beyond recognition. Others were filled with lists, names, dates, numbers that meant nothing to him. Then, buried beneath the pile, he found a photograph. He nearly dropped it. It was Emily. Younger. Maybe 10 years old. But she was not alone. There were other children in the picture, all standing in a white-walled room, dressed in identical gray uniforms, looking straight into the camera with the same hollow expressions. David's chest tightened. This was not just a missing person case. This was something bigger. Emily had not just been running from a dangerous man. She had been running from a past that should have never existed. A creak echoed from behind him. David froze. He was not alone. His fingers tightened around the papers as he slowly turned. A shadow moved in the doorway. Then a voice. Low. Familiar. I warned you, Miller. David's breath caught. The man from the black SUV. The same man in Emily's photograph. And the last thing David saw, before the world went dark, was the barrel of a gun. Darkness. A slow, sinking weight dragged David back to consciousness. His head throbbed. His limbs felt heavy, restrained. The sharp scent of metal and dust filled his lungs. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the warehouse. A dim overhead light buzzed weakly. The room was small, windowless, a concrete box. His wrists were tied to the chair, rope digging into his skin. Footsteps echoed. Then, a voice, calm, calculating. You should have walked away, Miller. David recognized him immediately. The man from the black SUV. The same man in Emily's photograph. David clenched his jaw. Where is she? The man sighed, stepping closer, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket. You have spent so much time chasing Emily Sinclair, he said, shaking his head. And yet, you still do not understand. David's pulse pounded. Understand what? The man leaned in, voice almost amused. That Emily Sinclair was never real. David's mind reeled. You are lying. The man gave him a patient smile. Am I? He pulled a file from a nearby table and tossed it in David's lap. David's hands were still tied, but he saw the name stamped on the cover. Subject 47A, Echo Facility. His stomach dropped. Slowly, the man opened it, flipping through the pages. She was born inside our program, he said. Raised with others like her. Trained. Conditioned. David's breath caught. You were saying she was, what? Part of an experiment? The man nodded. A highly classified one. Until she escaped. David's pulse raced. Escaped from what? The man sighed. From herself. David's thoughts raced back to Emily's notebook. The fragmented sentences, the fear, the way she had run from anyone who tried to help her. She was not just a girl who went missing. She had been manufactured. Her life had been designed. She was supposed to forget, the man continued. But Jonas Caldwell, he clicked his tongue, shaking his head, he ruined that. He helped her remember. David's fists tightened. That is why you killed him. That is why we will kill you." The words sent a cold bolt of fear through David's chest. But before he could process them, a new sound filled the room. A loud, blaring alarm. The man's expression changed. For the first time, he looked surprised. David turned just as the door burst open. And standing there was Emily. She moved fast. The first guard lunged at her. He was on the floor before he could touch her. The second man reached for his weapon. She knocked it out of his hands in a blur of motion. David had never seen her fight before. But it was not random. It was precise. Trained. Like someone who had been taught exactly how to kill. Emily grabbed a knife off the table and cut the ropes around David's wrists. "We have to go," she said breathlessly. David could barely process what was happening. "You came back." Her jaw clenched. "I never left." Gunfire rang out in the hallway. Emily grabbed his hand. "Move." They ran. The facility was larger than he expected. Dim corridors. Security cameras. Armed men closing in from every direction. David's mind raced. "Emily, what is this place? What did they do to you?" She yanked him into a side corridor, her eyes sharp. "I will tell you everything," she said. "But first, we need to get out alive." David did not argue. For 7 years, he had searched for her. Now, for the first time, she was fighting to save him. And he finally understood. Emily Sinclair was never lost. She had been hunted. And now, it was time to hunt back.